Welcome to the deep dive. We take those really dense health science topics and try to make them stick. Today, it's alterations in nutritional status. It's a big one, connecting physiology, disease, even public health.
Absolutely. And the core idea really is balance.
Yeah.
Your nutritional status is just how your body's doing with the nutrients it gets and uses.
Right. Intake versus expenditure.
Exactly. We're built for stability.
Yeah.
But, modern life often pushes that way off balance, leading to things like obesity or starvation.
Okay, let's ground this in the basics. Energy. We hear calories all the time. How does the body actually count this stuff? Is the calorie on my cereal box the real calorie?
Ah, good question. It's a common mix-up. So technically, a small c calorie is a physics unit amount of heat.
Tiny amount.
Very tiny. What you see on food labels, that's the large C's calorie, a kilocalorie, kilocal. That's 1,000 of the small ones. That's the energy potential in food we actually track.
Got it. And foods pack very different punches, energy-wise. Why is fat so, energy dense?
It's all down to the chemistry. When your body oxidizes fat, 1 gram gives you 9 kilocalories.
9.
Yeah. Compare that to proteins or carbs, they only give you 4 kcal per gram.
Less than half.
Right. And alcohol, interestingly, is pretty high too, at 7 kilocalogram.
Okay, so we take this energy in, then the body's either using it or saving it, like a bank account.
Yes, perfect analogy. Putting energy away, building things up, that's anabolism. Think synthesis, storage. It actually costs energy to do that.
Okay.
Then spending it, breaking things down for immediate use. That's catabolism. That produces energy.
And the currency for all this?
Is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the universal energy coin of the cell.
So, talking about saving. Most of our energy reserves, like over 90%, are parked in adipose tissue, fat cells. But it's not just sitting there, is it?
Not at all. Adipose tissue is incredibly active metabolically. It's practically an organ.
An organ? Wow.
And we have 2 main kinds. There's white fat, which is what most adults have. Big cells designed purely for storing triglycerides efficiently. Long-term savings.
Okay, and the other kind?
That's brown fat.
Yeah.
It's different. It has these specialized mitochondria. Its job isn't really storing energy or making lots of ATP. It's thermogenesis, making heat.
Heat generation. I've heard it's more common in babies.
Exactly. Keeps them warm. Adults have less, but how active our brown fat is?
Wow.
Well, that's a really hot topic in metabolic research right now. Could it help us burn more energy? We're trying to figure that out.
And here's a key insight. Fat tissue tox. It acts like an endocrine gland sending out signals. Adipokines, right?
Precisely. It communicates about the energy reserves. And the star player here is leptin.
Leptin, okay.
It's released by fat cells, and the amount released is basically proportional to how much fat you have stored.
So more fat, more leptin.
Generally, yes. And leptin goes to the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, and the message is essentially, hey, reserves are high, ease up on the food intake, maybe burn a bit more energy.
So it should decrease appetite and increase metabolism.
That's the intended effect. Decrease food intake, increase thermogenesis. But here's the critical piece for understanding obesity. Often, with very high fat stores, you get very high leptin, but the brain stops listening properly.
Leptin resistance.
Exactly. The signal is shouting, but the receptor isn't responding effectively. So the brain thinks stores are lower than they are, and it doesn't curb appetite or boost expenditure like it should. It's a major breakdown in that long-term regulation.
That failure really sets the stage for problems. Okay, let's flip to the other side of the equation. Energy expenditure. How do we actually burn calories? It's not just running on a treadmill, is it?
No, not at all. The sources break it down into 5 main ways we generate heat. Thermogenesis.
Yeah.
The biggest chunk, like 50 to 70% of your total daily burn, is just keeping the lights on. That's your basal metabolic rate, or BMR.
The energy for just existing.
Pretty much. Minimum energy needed for life. And it's heavily influenced by how much muscle mass you have. More muscle, higher BMR, which is also why BMR tends to drop as we age, unfortunately.
Okay, that's the baseline. What else?
Then there's the energy cost of actually processing the food you eat. That's diet-induced thermogenesis.
So eating burns calories.
It does. Digesting, absorbing, assimilating nutrients, it takes energy. On average, maybe about 8% of the calories you consume are used just for this.
Interesting.
And it varies by macronutrient. High-protein meals actually cost significantly more to process. They can boost this thermogenesis up to maybe 30%.
Wow. So that thermic effect of food is real.
Very real. Then, of course, there's exercise-induced thermogenesis. That's the obvious one. Hitting the gym, going for a run. Strenuous activity causes the biggest increase in metabolic rate over baseline.
Right. But what about just everyday movement? Fidgeting, walking around the office.
Ah, that's non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Neat. It's everything that's not sleeping, eating, or dedicated exercise. Maintaining posture, walking to the car, tapping your foot.
Does that really add up?
It absolutely can. And here's the thing. Only exercise and NEAT are really under our voluntary control and can vary a lot. Some research suggests people who naturally have lower NEAT, maybe they fidget less, sit more, might be more prone to weight gain.
Yeah.
So boosting NEAT could be a useful strategy.
Makes sense. And the last one.
Environmentally related thermogenesis. Think shivering when you're cold. That's involuntary muscle contraction to generate heat. There's also non-shivering thermogenesis activated by the sympathetic nervous system, which can actually switch on that brown fat we talked about.
Fascinating how many ways the body regulates this. Okay, let's shift to the fuel itself. Nutrients. We have guidelines, like the DRIs, dietary reference intakes. Why break down needs into proteins, fats, carbs? Aren't calories just calories?
Not quite. Calories provide energy, yes, but macronutrients provide specific building blocks and perform functions energy alone can't. Take proteins. You need them for building tissues, making enzymes, antibodies for your immune system.
Critical stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the key thing here is the essential amino acids. There are 9 of them your body cannot make. You must get them from your diet. If you don't, you simply can't build certain vital proteins.
Okay, essential means essential. What about fats? We know they're energy dense, but there are good fats, bad fats. Gets
Yeah.
complicated.
It does. Generally, saturated fats tend to raise cholesterol levels. Unsaturated fats, mono and polyunsaturated, tend to lower them. But the real villain the sources highlight, trans fatty acids.
Usually man-made, right? In processed foods.
Often, yes,
Okay.
through a process called hydrogenation.
Mm.
And they're kind of the worst of both worlds. They raise the LDL, the bad cholesterol, and they lower the HDL, the good cholesterol. Double trouble.
Yikes.
And we also need certain polyunsaturated fats, the PUFAs, specifically omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. They're essential too. Very basically, omega-6s tend to promote things like inflammation and clotting, while omega-3s tend to decrease them. Getting the right balance is crucial for health.
Okay. And carbs. They get a bad rap sometimes, but they're supposed to be our main energy source.
They are. The recommendation is typically 45 to 65% of your daily calories should come from carbs. And there's a minimum requirement.
Oh, why a minimum?
To prevent your body from having to break down its own proteins for energy that's tissue wasting, and to avoid excessive ketone body production, ketosis, you need at least about 50 to 100 grams of carbs per day to prevent that.
Got it. So we've covered the big three, but what about the small stuff? Vitamins, minerals, fiber, they don't give us energy, so why are they vital?
Because they make everything else work. Micronutrients, vitamins and minerals are like the tools and catalysts. Vitamins often act as coenzymes. They're essential helpers for the enzymes that release energy from carbs, fats, and proteins.
Can't unlock the energy without them.
Exactly. And we group them by solubility. Fat solubles are A, D, E, and K. Your body stores these so you can get too much, leading to toxicity. Water solubles are the B vitamins and vitamin C. Your body doesn't store these well, excess usually gets flushed out. Minerals have tons of role structure, like in bones, maintaining fluid and acid-base balance, nerve signals, muscle contraction, essential infrastructure.
And fiber. We hear a lot about fiber.
Right. Fiber is basically carbohydrate we can't digest, but it does crucial work. One is bulking, it adds mass, helps you feel full, helps keep things moving in the gut.
Okay.
Another is viscosity. Some fibers form a gel in the gut, which can slow down sugar absorption, helping blood glucose control, and can bind cholesterol, helping lower levels.
Nice.
And third is fermentation. Certain fibers feed the good bacteria in your large intestine. Those bacteria then produce beneficial compounds, like short-chain fatty acids, which are good for gut health, and maybe even wider health.
So fiber does a lot, even though we don't absorb it directly. Okay, how does the body actually decide when to eat and when to stop? Hunger, appetite, satiety.
Right, those are distinct feelings. Hunger is that primal physical need for food stomach pangs, maybe low energy. Appetite is more specific. The desire for a particular food, often triggered by sight or smell, even if you're not truly hungry. And satiety is that feeling of fullness and satisfaction that tells you to stop eating.
What's pulling the strings behind the scenes?
The main control hub is in the hypothalamus, a part of the brain, specifically the arcuate nucleus. It's like a command center, integrating signals from everywhere.
Signals like?
Well, short-term signals from the gut, like the hormone ghrelin, produced when your stomach is empty. It's orexigenic, meaning it stimulates hunger.
Makes you want to eat.
Yep. Then, as you eat and your gut fills and nutrients are absorbed, other signals are released that are anorexigenic. They promote satiety and tell you to stop. It also monitors nutrient levels in the blood, like glucose and fatty acids. And it gets input from higher brain centers about the sight, smell, taste of food.
A complex balancing act.
Very. And this is mostly short-term regulation. Long-term regulation ties back to those energy stores we talked about, with signals like leptin playing a key role over days and weeks. Even things like high levels of keto acids from breaking down fat can suppress appetite long-term. That's part of why ketogenic diets can reduce hunger for some people.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's shift gears quite dramatically to the issue of too much energy storage. Overweight and obesity. The numbers globally are, well, huge.
They are staggering. Overweight is generally defined as a body mass index, BMI, of 25 or greater, and obesity is a BMI of 30 or greater.
Calculated from height and weight, simple measure, but
But the causes are anything but simple. It's truly multifactorial. Genetics plays a role, absolutely. Metabolism, behavior, our environment, culture, socioeconomic status, they all interact.
who's that saying?
Right. Genetics loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. Our genes might predispose some people, but our modern environment with easy access to cheap, calorie-dense foods and lifestyles that involve very little physical activity is a massive driver of the epidemic.
Now, clinically, it's not just if someone has obesity, but where the fat is stored that really matters for health risk, isn't it?
Absolutely critical distinction.
Right.
We talk about lower body obesity, sometimes called peripheral or pear shape. Fat accumulates more around the hips and thighs,
Okay.
versus upper body obesity, also called central, visceral, or apple shape. Here, the fat is concentrated around the abdomen inside the abdominal cavity surrounding the organs. We measure this often with waist circumference or waist-to-hip ratio.
And that visceral fat is the dangerous kind. Why?
Because of its metabolic activity and its plumbing, essentially. Visceral fat is more inflammatory. It releases more adipokines, like TNF-alpha, and crucially, its breakdown products, free fatty acids, drain directly into the portal vein,
Which goes straight to the left.
straight to the liver.
Yeah.
So the liver gets bathed in these fatty acids and inflammatory signals coming directly from that abdominal fat. This directly drives insulin resistance in the liver and promotes the development of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Wow. So it's not just extra weight, it's actively damaging the liver.
Correct. That's why waist circumference can actually be a better predictor of health risks like heart disease and type 2 diabetes than BMI alone, because it reflects that dangerous visceral fat.
And the health consequences of obesity are widespread.
Across the board,
Yeah.
increased risk of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes is almost a given. Many types of cancer, sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, gallbladder disease, you name it. Having severe obesity, say a BMI over 40, can significantly shorten lifespan by maybe 6 to 13 years, according to the sources.
So what can be done? Treatment.
It has to be multi-pronged. Lifestyle change is always the foundation. Healthier diet, reduced calories, increased physical activity, behavioral therapy to support those changes.
But sometimes that's not enough.
For many, especially with severe obesity, it isn't. Then we consider pharmacotherapy medications that can help, often by working on appetite centers in the brain or reducing fat absorption, but they're adjuncts, used alongside lifestyle changes for specific people based on BMI and risk factors.
And for the most severe cases.
Bariatric surgery remains the most effective treatment for severe obesity, generally BMI over 40 or over 35 if they have significant related health problems.
Different types of surgery.
Yes, broadly categorized as restrictive, making the stomach smaller, malabsorptive, reducing nutrient absorption, or often a combination, like the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. And a major benefit besides weight loss is that these surgeries often lead to remission of type 2 diabetes, sometimes very quickly.
Remarkable. Okay, let's pivot completely to the other end of the spectrum. Undernutrition, starvation. What happens when the body doesn't get enough?
Malnutrition is basically failing to get or use enough nutrients. Causes are vast poverty, lack of access to food, but also acute or chronic illnesses that increase needs or impair absorption, or self-imposed restriction like in eating disorders.
The sources make a key distinction within protein-energy malnutrition, PEM, marasmus versus kwashiorkor. Can you unpack that?
Yes, this is a classic comparison. Marasmus results from a severe deficiency of both protein and calories, essentially overall starvation.
The body is just wasting away.
Exactly. You see progressive loss of muscle mass, loss of fat stores. The person, often a child, looks emaciated, wasted. Growth is stunted. They've run out of fuel and are breaking down everything.
Okay. And kwashiorkor?
Kwashiorkor is different. It's primarily a deficiency of protein, even if calorie intake might be somewhat adequate, often from starchy foods.
So they might not look as skeletal.
Correct. They might even retain subcutaneous fat. But the lack of protein is devastating internally. They can't synthesize essential proteins, especially albumin, the main protein in blood plasma,
And low albumin
leads to edema. Severe hypoalbuminemia means the blood can't hold on to fluid properly, so it leaks out into the tissues, causing generalized swelling, particularly in the belly and legs. That's the classic presentation of a swollen appearance despite underlying malnutrition.
That's a stark difference. Other signs.
Yes. Often apathy, changes in skin and hair. The hair might become reddish or lose pigment, sometimes called the flag sign. And the skin can develop lesions, sometimes described as flaky paint dermatosis. It's really a failure of the body's structural and functional proteins.
And we see malnutrition impact illness even in developed countries, right? Like in hospital patients.
Oh, definitely. Severe illness or trauma massively increases metabolic demands and protein breakdown. If nutritional needs aren't met, patients lose muscle mass rapidly, including respiratory muscles, which impairs breathing.
Weakens the whole system.
Yes. Organ mass shrinks liver, heart, gut. Serum proteins drop, wound healing is poor, the immune system weakens. Malnutrition significantly worsens outcomes in critically ill patients.
Finally, let's touch on eating disorders. These are complex psychiatric conditions with severe nutritional consequences. Anorexia nervosa first.
Anorexia nervosa, AN, is characterized by maintaining a significantly low body weight, typically less than 85% of what's expected, driven by an intense fear of gaining weight and a distorted perception of body shape or size, often accompanied by amenorrhea in females.
And the physical complications are severe.
Profound, reflecting chronic starvation, things like osteoporosis due to hormonal changes and nutrient deficiencies, severe bradycardia, slow heart rate, electrolyte imbalances, and disturbingly, loss of actual brain tissue, both white and gray matter. The body is consuming itself.
Scary stuff. How does bulimia nervosa differ?
Bulimia nervosa, BN, involves recurrent episodes of binge eating, consuming a very large amount of food in a discrete period, feeling out of control, followed by compensatory behaviors to prevent weight gain.
Like purging.
Yes, self-induced vomiting is common, but also misuse of laxatives, diuretics, fasting, or excessive exercise.
Yeah.
A key difference from AN is that individuals with BN are usually normal weight or even slightly overweight,
So the damage is different.
often related directly to the compensatory behaviors. Frequent vomiting causes dental erosion from stomach acid, swollen salivary glands, peritonitis. Laxative abuse can damage the colon, and purging can lead to dangerous electrolyte problems, especially hypokalemia, low potassium, with metabolic alkalosis, which can affect the heart.
And there's also binge eating disorder?
Right. Binge eating disorder, BED, involves those recurrent binge eating episodes, but without the regular compensatory behaviors seen in BN, so it's strongly associated with overweight and obesity. In fact, it's considered the most common eating disorder in the U.S.
Wow. Quite a journey we've taken from the basics of ATP and calories
All the way through hormonal signals like leptin, the different ways we burn energy,
to the complex realities of obesity, visceral fat, liver damage.
and then the stark consequences of undernutrition, marasmus, kwashiorkor, and the specific challenges of eating disorders. It really covers the whole spectrum.
Understanding these details, like why central fat is so risky, or how leptin resistance works, or the physiological basis for edema and kwashiorkor, is just crucial for anyone in healthcare.
Absolutely. It connects the biochemistry and physiology directly to the patient you see in front of you.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Considering everything we've discussed, the global scale of both obesity and undernutrition, the complex interplay of biology and environment, if you were tasked with tackling this, what blend of strategies, policy, community support, personalized medicine do you think holds the most promise? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope pulling these key concepts from the source material was helpful.
And a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team. We'll catch you on the next one.